The history of U.S. regulation of domestically produced food and pharmaceuticals goes back to the end of the 19th century, and a pioneering researcher named Harvey Washington Wiley, who was the chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture's Division of Chemistry. And from those early beginnings, a regulatory environment developed in fits and starts over time as consumers and government and industry tried to develop the best way to protect the nation's food supply. And one of the first great tests of that regulatory environment came in 1959, when a new regulation ran into a venerable product and resulted in what has been described as the nation's first great food scare. The Great Cranberry Scare of 1959 changed the way Americans looked at their food, trusted their government, and consumed their cranberries. It's history that deserves to be remembered. Born in 1844, Harvey Wiley was a Civil War veteran who had degrees in both medicine and chemistry. He was offered the post of chief chemist for the Department of Agriculture in 1882, largely because of his expertise in the chemistry of sugar, as the department was interested in growing a U.S. sugar industry based on sorghum. In the position, Wiley started conducting research into the adulteration and misbranding of food and drugs on the American market, including so-called poison squad studies, where the effects of a diet consisting in part of the various preservatives were tested on human volunteers. The studies and subsequent publications moved the public, including a campaign where 1 million U.S. women wrote the White House and spurred Congress to pass the landmark Consumer Protection Act called the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, also called the Wiley Act. For his contributions, Wiley was popularly called the father of the Pure Food and Drugs Act. While the Act gave the Division of Chemistry some regulatory power, its ability to enforce regulation was constantly challenged, and the ever-present wrangling between industry and regulation led to a 1927 reorganization of the Division of Chemistry into the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Organization, which then, in 1930, was renamed the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. A growing consumer movement, pressured by muckraking journalists and events such as the tragic mass poisoning caused by the untested pharmaceutical elixir sulfanilamide that killed 100 people in 1937, pressed Congress to give the FDA significantly more robust powers, with the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The Act has been amended many times, and today is the center of the Food and Drug Administrations, which today has nearly 15,000 employees and a budget in excess of $5 billion, regulatory power. One of the amendments to the Act was driven by James Delaney, a U.S. congressman from New York, who chaired a select committee to conduct an investigation and study of the use of chemicals, pesticides, and insecticides in and with respect to food products. The results of his findings resulted in the 1958 Food Additives Amendment to the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetic Act that was commonly called the Delaney Clause. It read, "The Secretary of the Food and Drug Administration shall not approve for use in food any chemical additive found to induce cancer in man or after tests found to induce cancer in animals." The reasoning behind the strict nature of the Delaney Clause was stated by influential researcher Dr. Wilhelm Huper, who testified before Congress. "I do not believe that one can establish a safe dose of carcinogens," he said. "I do not think that we have the method or evidence available by which we can reliably determine a safe dose." The legislation was undoubtedly well intended, but it would lead to some thorny questions, as we have found out that essentially pretty much anything can give a rat cancer if you give it to them in a large enough dose. And one of the first tests of the amendment had to do with the berry from a dwarf evergreen shrub called Vaccinium macrocarpon, otherwise known as the North American cranberry. Cranberries are naturally hard, sour, and bitter. The name is likely derived from craneberry and is because part of the flower of the shrub resembles the neck, head, and bill of a crane. There are many cranberry varieties in Europe where the name was derived. But the North American berries were introduced to colonists by Narragansett peoples who had harvested wild berries at least from the 16th century, perhaps much farther back. The berries were often ground with dried meats into pemmican, a highly nutritious preserved food that was a significant part of Native American cuisine. The berries were also used for red dyes, and due to their astringent qualities, in medical poultices. Despite the sour taste, they were recognized fairly early for their nutritional value, with a 1672 book noting they are excellent against the scurvy, a quality derived from their high vitamin C content. The same text noted their sour taste, and said that they were generally boiled down with sugar to make a sauce for meat that is a delicate sauce, especially with roasted mutton. To understand how cranberries fit in with the Delaney Clause, you have to understand the unique nature of the fruit. Cranberries grow on trailing vines like a strawberry, but the vines thrive on a special combination of soils and water properties found in wetlands. Cranberries grow in beds layered with sand, peat, and gravel that are commonly called bogs. The bogs were originally formed by receding glaciers, which carved impermeable kettle holes lined with clay. The clay lining prevented materials from leaching into the groundwater, and as the glaciers melted, rocks and organic materials were deposited on top of the clay, creating the ideal environment for cranberries, which require acid peat soil, an adequate fresh water supply, and a growing season that extends from April to November. Wild cranberries of Massachusetts, for example, flower in June and July and are ready to pick by September. North American cranberries were being exported to Europe by the 17th century, and recipes for preserving the berries, as well as making sauces, tarts, and pies, were common in the 18th century in both American and English cookbooks. Still, because of their unique nature, cranberries were still being collected wild, not cultivated. It wasn't until the early 1800s that Henry Hall, a veteran of the Revolutionary War who lived in Dennis, Massachusetts, started to cultivate the berries. Hall noticed that sand blown in from nearby dunes helped vines grow faster. By adding sand in appropriate quantities, per acre yields of berries increased. Modern growers still spread an inch or two of sand on their bogs every 3 years. As the berries grow on vines, the vines do not need to be regularly replanted, and some Massachusetts vines are reputed to be over 150 years old and still producing fruit. Hall's innovations allowed greater production, and a commercial industry grew that, combined with a greater availability of granulated sugar, allowed the fruit to grow in popularity. As it did, it grew in association with the holiday season. The berries were bright, shiny, and red, making excellent decorations. They were harvested and available in winter, and as they are slow to spoil, lasted well through the Christmas season. The season was also known for feasts of roasted meat, which went well with cranberry sauce. Cranberries became so popular that after the Civil War, successful efforts to grow cranberries in New Jersey led to what has been described as a cranberry fever, a rush of investment to grow cranberries that was largely a bust, as the plants are finicky and the people hoping to get rich quick had little understanding of how to actually grow them. Cultivation methods slowly developed, including less time-intensive methods of harvesting. This was largely the result of careful study of growing factors and methods, and the finicky nature of the plant meant that the industry developed growers' organizations early on, which worked not just to help develop growing methods, but to collectively market the product. The success of a century of effort really showed in 1959 when the industry had already become a $50 million a year business. And 1959 looked to be a bumper record crop, 125 million pounds. Growers were expecting to make record profits, and likely they would have, except for the Delaney Clause. The problem was an herbicide called aminotriazole. A chlorophyll inhibitor, aminotriazole, was used by cranberry growers starting in the 1950s to eliminate sedges, rushes, horsetails, and deep-rooted grasses from the bogs, clearing the water for the cranberries. Growers were instructed to use the chemical only after the harvest so as to keep it off the finished fruit, but trace amounts could still exist in extremely small quantities. Manufacturers petitioned the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to allow small amounts of residue, up to 1 part per million if necessary. But the FDA rejected the petition. There was a problem. New research had suggested that large, long-term doses of the chemical suppressed thyroid function in rats, encouraging tumors, possibly cancerous, to form. That made aminotriazole a carcinogen, and while the study suggested that a rat would have to eat a vast quantity of contaminated cranberries over its entire lifespan to increase its risk for cancer, the Delaney Clause said that carcinogens were not acceptable in any amount. When trace amounts of the chemical were found in a part of the cranberry crop just 17 days before Thanksgiving, the reaction by the FDA resulted in the Great Cranberry Scare of 1959. The chemical was found in a few shipments of berries from Washington and Oregon, states which produced a tiny fraction of the annual crop. But strictly reading the new Delaney Clause, and in an abundance of caution, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Arthur Fleming, moved to limit the sale of berries from Washington and Oregon until the industry could develop a plan to separate out the contaminated berries. But the true damage came when a reporter asked the Secretary whether a housewife should buy cranberries for her family. Fleming answered that if a housewife wasn't sure of the origin of the product, then, to be on the safe side, she doesn't buy. Suddenly, cranberries were not safe, contaminated with the terrifying-sounding aminotriazole. Despite the fact that only a tiny portion of the crop had tested positive for the chemical, grocery stores pulled cranberries off of shelves, restaurants dropped them from their menus, and some communities banned their sale. Life magazine published a list of alternative dishes, including spiced crab apples, frosted grapes, currant jelly, and beach plum preserve. John Deckus, a cranberry grower from Massachusetts, said on National Public Radio, "We had 40 trailer loads of cranberries canceled within 1 hour after that announcement. My reaction at the time was, oh my God, it's over." Ocean Spray, a cranberry grower cooperative, tried to limit the damage. The executive vice president sent a telegram to Fleming. "We demand that you take immediate steps to rectify the incalculable damages caused by your ill-formed and ill-advised press statements yesterday." There were efforts by politicians as well. Richard Nixon, then vice president and campaigning for president, ate 4 helpings of cranberries on November 12th. That made the headline of the Washington Post the next day. He stood proudly for the berry, saying, "I, like other Americans, expect to eat traditional cranberries with my family on Thanksgiving Day." Not to be outdone, the Democratic nominee, Senator John Kennedy, conspicuously drank 2 glasses of cranberry juice the next day. The Post then noted, bipartisan cranberry consumption. Unconfirmed reports said Kennedy quipping, "If we both pass away, I feel I shall have performed a great public service by taking the vice president with me." This was the first great modern food scare in the nation. It was a time of more powerful media, of a more educated public, of more distrust of corporate motives. People were bombarded with contradictory science and breathless news reports. The FDA tried to limit the damage, creating a testing and labeling program to clear berries before Thanksgiving. But the death blow came Thanksgiving Day, when the First Lady, Mamie Eisenhower, served applesauce instead. The AP headline read, "No cranberries for President." The season was a disaster. The cranberry industry reported $20 million in losses in January. Ocean Spray announced it had laid off 1/3 of its workforce. Sales were 70% below normal for Thanksgiving and 50% below normal for Christmas. The industry needed some $10 million in subsidies just to survive the season. It was also unnecessary. In the end, more than 99% of the crop was found to be uncontaminated, and the few batches that were in minute amounts. Not one person is known to have been harmed by the berries. There's really a mixed legacy for the Great Cranberry Scare of 1959. It did give rise to some consumer advocacy that achieved some important reforms, but also, according to Dr. Elizabeth Whalen of the American Council of Science and Health, the 1959 Cranberry Scare set the stage for decades of completely unnecessary anxiety about trace amounts of agricultural chemicals and additives in food. The cranberry sales rebounded the following year, but the industry learned a valuable lesson. One of the reasons that the scare had been so devastating is that the product was almost exclusively consumed in the short period of the holidays, which made it extremely vulnerable to disruption. Cranberry juice was produced and sold at the time, but it was really actually formulated for the taste of growers, not the general public, and it wasn't marketed by the industry. But with the help of the government and as a result of the cranberry scare, the industry started to create products like cranberry juice cocktails and dried cranberries that made cranberries popular year-round and therefore less vulnerable to disruption. And over time, the industry actually grew. The cranberry crop today is some 7 times what it was in 1959. The industry stopped using aminotriazole altogether, but it's still used in non-agricultural settings, like clearing grasses from highway medians. Over time, the zero-tolerance policy for carcinogens became unsustainable. Partly because of the cranberry scare, testing methods improved, and as New Yorker magazine noted, in the years that followed the cranberry scare, dozens and then hundreds of chemicals would prove carcinogenic in humans or animals. Testing sensitivity increased 1,000,000-fold. Strict application of the law, one researcher noted, undermined the ability of the food and agricultural industries to produce almost any foodstuff that was free of some degree of contamination. More flexible methods of assessing toxicity were needed, and the Delaney Clause was finally fully repealed in 1992, but definitive answers still elude us. Consumers are still caught between advocates and industry, still faced with conflicting science, and still confronted with what seems to be ever more common food scares. This week we celebrate the holiday of Thanksgiving, and according to World Population Review, some 7 out of 8 American families will consume turkey. It's well known in the United States that turkey was served at the first Thanksgiving in 1621 and has been the protein of choice for the holiday ever since. And like most of what we think we know about the prodigious poultry, that common story is, well, not necessarily true. In fact, you might be as surprised about the history of the big-breasted holiday centerpiece as you would be if your holiday turkey was stolen by the Bumpus's dogs. The turkey is a native bird of North America, whose preferred habitat is mixed conifer hardwood forests. Populations are often close to oak forest, as acorns are a favorite food, although they are omnivores, who eat all sorts of seeds and berries, as well as insects, spiders, caterpillars, snails, slugs, worms, and even small snakes and lizards. They are taxonomically classified as the genus Meleagris, which is confusingly the ancient Greek word for guinea fowl. While there are several species in the fossil record, only 2 species remain. The wild turkey, Meleagris gallopavo, is common in the United States and parts of Canada and Mexico. To add more confusion, the species name gallopavo is derived from the Latin words for rooster, gallo, and pavo, peacock. So the wild turkey is named, essentially, guinea fowl rooster peacock, even though it is none of the above. The other existing species is a slightly smaller and shorter-legged ocellated turkey, Meleagris ocellata, native to the Yucatan Peninsula. Ocellata is Latin for small eyes and doesn't refer to the bird's eyes, which are not notably smaller than those of its cousin Meleagris gallopavo, but because of dots on the tail feathers that resemble eyes. If you've never seen an ocellated turkey, that isn't a surprise. While they are hunted by and a significant food source for certain ethnic groups that live in the Yucatan, they are rarely seen outside their native habitat because while they are easily domesticated, they do not breed in captivity. Currently, 6 subspecies of the wild turkey are recognized, although, interestingly, the subspecies Mexican wild turkey is now thought to be extinct, even though it is its descendants that you'll likely serve with gravy on Thursday. In fact, it was this subspecies that was likely the first to be domesticated, one of only a few domesticated animals in the New World. Exactly when is still in question. Writing in the open scientific journal PLOS One in 2012, a study led by Aaron Kennedy Thornton of Trent University, Ontario, Canada, notes that the discovery of the bones of M. gallopavo in an ancient Mayan site in Guatemala, well out of the natural range of the bird, is evidence that the birds were part of Mesoamerican trade networks, suggesting capture and domestication as early as the 4th century BC, as much as 1,000 years earlier than previously thought. And an international team of researchers writing in the journal Royal Society Open Science in 2018 established that there was probably a thriving business in turkeys along the continent's fledgling trade routes. Moreover, the University of Colorado Arts and Sciences magazine notes analysis of DNA from turkey bones at archaeological sites and from modern samples of wild turkeys throughout their range indicate that domesticated birds in central Mexico and the domesticated birds from the southwest are distinctly different. Examining archaeological sites in Tennessee in 2010, researchers at Florida State University, writing in the journal Archaeological Science Reports, that as early as 1200 to 1400 AD, Native Americans in the American Southeast were also managing and raising turkeys. So the domestication of turkeys in the Americas appears to have developed relatively independently in at least 3 different domestication events. Florida State University News notes turkeys have been part of Native American life long before the first Thanksgiving in 1621. Researcher Tanya Perez, an associate professor of anthropology at Florida State University, was quoted in the Florida State University News. It appears Native Americans were favoring males for their bones for tools, and they certainly would have favored males for their feathers. They tend to be much brighter and more colorful than females of the species. Their feathers were used on arrows, in headdresses, and clothing. The meat was used for food. Their bones were used for tools, including scratchers used in ritual ceremonies. There are even representations of turkeys in artifacts from the time. An intricately engraved marine shell pendant found at a site in central Tennessee shows 2 turkeys facing each other. So at this point, it's probably appropriate to address the elephant-sized turkey in the room. How did a bird from North America that was domesticated by and important to the culture of Native Americans come to be called turkey? The Los Angeles Times wrote in 2010, the first Europeans to lay eyes on the bird we today call a turkey were likely Christopher Columbus and the crew of his 4th American voyage in 1502. They called the animal Gallina de la Tierra, or land chicken. That name is odd since both turkeys and chickens actually do fly, and as the contest goes, turkeys are generally better flyers than chickens. although neither is likely to win a prize at the Bird Olympics. These land chickens were an early part of the Columbian exchange, with Spanish conquistadors finding them in Mexico. The website France Amérique explains the American fowl arrived in Europe aboard Spanish galleons in the early 16th century. Adopted as a rare and exotic food, turkey soon outshone peacock at prestigious dinners and delighted foodies with its tender, refined white flesh. In 1534, writer François Rabelais included a poulet d'Inde, literally a chicken from India, which is how turkey got the name dinde in French, on the menu of a feast he described in his novel Gargantua. 15 years later, 66 turkeys were served at a banquet organized by the city of Paris to celebrate the coronation of Queen Catherine de' Medici. Now, wait a tick. Chicken from India? Yes, Dictionary.com explains. The original word in French, coq d'Inde, meant rooster of India and has since shortened to dinde. Those names likely derive from the common misconception that India and the New World were one and the same. But how did the India bird that wasn't from India get to be called turkey? Well, that name originated in England. There are two different stories as to how that might have happened. One possibility is that the birds were first imported into England by merchants from the Mediterranean. These merchants traded goods from throughout the Mediterranean, including the Ottoman Empire. National Public Radio explained in 2008 the British weren't particularly precise about products arriving from the East. Persian carpets were called turkey rugs. India flour was called turkey flour. Hungarian carpet bags were called turkey bags. If a product came to London from the far side of the Danube, Londoners called it turkey. And that's what happened to the American bird. Thus, an American bird got the name turkey cock, which was then shortened to turkey. So the birds that came from North America, which the French thought was part of India, were imported by merchants who might or might not have been from the Ottoman Empire, and thus the English called the bird turkey. And if you were wondering, Dictionary.com explains that the Turkish word for a turkey is Hindi, which literally means Indian. The Indian website The Pioneer explains that since the Turks knew that this fowl was not theirs, they made a completely different mistake and called it Hindi. The alternative explanation also has to do with a bird not from Turkey. National Public Radio explains long before Christopher Columbus went to America, Europeans already had a wild fowl they liked to eat. It came from Guinea in Western Africa. It was a guinea fowl. It was eaten in London, so it got the nickname turkey cock, because supposedly it came from Constantinople. The LA Times asked, was there some Turkish merchant who brought the animals to England, or were the English just atrocious with geography? When the North American birds started being brought by merchants, the Londoners noted the aesthetic similarity between the African bird and the North American bird, and the name carried across. Exactly when the bird arrived in England isn't clear. Some sources claim that Henry VIII, who ruled until 1547, was the first to eat turkey for Christmas dinner, while others contend that the bird was not imported into England until after his death. That brings up a particularly odd example of the Mandela effect. The website Very Well Mind explains that the Mandela effect refers to a situation in which a large mass of people believes that an event occurred when it did not. The term itself is named after former South African President Nelson Mandela, whom many people seem to recall having died in a South African prison in the 1980s, only to be surprised when, in 1990, he was released from prison very much alive, serving as president of South Africa and finally dying not in prison in 2013. In this case, the aptly named website debunkingmandelaeffects.com writes that many people seem to recall that Henry VIII is holding a giant turkey leg in a famous painting by German-Swiss painter Hans Holbein the Younger, painted in 1536. And because of this, popular depictions of Henry VIII tend to include the rotund Roi munching a giant turkey leg. And the problem is that memory is wrong, and Henry VIII is instead merely holding a pair of gloves in the picture. Henry VIII aside, the LA Times explains that about 100 years after the New World turkey arrived in Europe, the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts, where they found an animal that bore a strong resemblance to the turkey that they knew from back home, although this wild variety did not take kindly to attempts at being domesticated. The English, who named the New World bird after turkey, came back to the New World and passed that name on to the native birds who, were they to speak English and care what we called them, might have been somewhat confused by the association. Still, the modern breeds that are used for consumption today are all actually derived from European birds that have been imported from Mexico, and are thus descendants of the Mexican wild turkey, a subspecies that is now extinct in the wild. But were there turkeys at the first Thanksgiving? Well, there's some debate about that, but probably not. Encyclopedia Britannica explains that there is indeed evidence of a meal shared between Pilgrim settlers at Plymouth Colony and Wampanoag people in late 1621, but there is no indication that turkey was served. For meat, the Wampanoag brought deer, and the Pilgrims provided wild fowl. Now, strictly speaking, that fowl could have been turkeys, which were native to the area, but historians think it was probably ducks or geese. Although Troy Bickham, a professor of history at Texas A&M University, explained in 2022, I do think it's possible that the Pilgrims ate turkey in 1621, and certainly was served at celebrations in New England throughout the colonial period. But that connection between Thanksgiving and turkeys wasn't really cemented until about 200 years later, and it has something to do with a famous sheep. Whether there was or wasn't turkey at the first Thanksgiving, Bickham argues that historians like me, who have studied the history of food, have found that most modern Thanksgiving traditions began in the mid-19th century, more than 2 centuries after the Pilgrims' first harvest celebration. The reinvention of the Pilgrim celebration as a national holiday was largely the work of Sarah Hale. Born in New Hampshire in 1784, as a young widow she published poetry to earn a living. Most notably, she wrote the nursery rhyme, "Mary Had a Little Lamb." In 1837, Hale became the editor of the popular magazine Godey's Ladies' Book. Fiercely religious and family-focused, it crusaded for the creation of an annual national holiday of thanksgiving and praise, commemorating the Pilgrims' Thanksgiving feast. The San Bernardino Sun writes that in 1827, author Sarah Josephine Hale devoted a chapter of her novel Northwood, A Tale of New England, to describing her ideal version of a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. In the book, Hale writes, the roasted turkey took precedence on this occasion, being placed at the head of the table, and well did it become its lordly station. In September 1863, Hale wrote a letter to the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, in which she argued, "You may have observed that for some years past there has been an increasing interest felt in our land to have the Thanksgiving held on the same day, in all the states. It now needs national recognition and authoritative fixation only to become permanently an American custom and institution." Previously, days of Thanksgiving had been largely proclaimed by state governors, and the celebration varied. Hale's letter prompted Lincoln to proclaim the final Thursday of 1863 as a day of Thanksgiving. The holiday was signed into law by President Ulysses Grant in the 1870 Holiday Act. The tradition was again reinforced by a work of fiction. The Sun continues. The traditional image of a feast, complete with stuffed turkey and numerous other dishes, took root in 1889 when noted American author Jane G. Austen wrote a fictional account of the 1621 feast in her book Standish on Standish, A Story of the Pilgrims. In any case, over the course of the 19th century, Thanksgiving turkeys became the thing to eat on Thanksgiving. Bickham explains. One reason for this, a roasted turkey makes a perfect celebratory centerpiece. The second one is that turkey is also practical for serving to a large crowd. In 2015, food historian Emily Rood recalled a nearly forgotten bit of turkey tradition in Time magazine. Many have been the tales of the great cattle drives. Hardly anybody remembers the great turkey walks, recounts author Kathleen Carr in her book The Great Turkey Walk. And indeed, in antebellum America, a parade of thousands of turkeys gobbling their way down country roads to urban markets was a regular sight in the weeks before Thanksgiving. Vermont turkeys hiked their way to Boston, Kentucky, and Tennessee turkeys marched proudly into Richmond, and some western birds even found themselves driven the thousands of miles between Missouri and Colorado. Rood notes that the tradition carried on in the U.S. well into the 1930s in some regions. While turkeys ride to market now by truck, the tradition lives on in Thanksgiving time charity walks and runs, which are commonly called turkey trots. It was the 1863 celebration that created the foundation for another tradition, WhiteHouse.gov explains. During the Civil War, Tad Lincoln asked his father to spare a turkey named Jack from a holiday meal. President Abraham Lincoln obliged his son and pardoned the fortunate turkey. When, in 1947, the National Turkey Federation began the tradition of presenting a live turkey to the President of the United States, the popular story is that President Truman restarted the tradition of the president officially pardoning a turkey. And, of course, the popular story is incorrect. A November 2007 edition of the Washington Post writes that the photos of Truman pardoning his turkeys looked real enough. Live turkey, live prez, grandly extending his hand towards the Tom's waddle in a gesture that surely said emancipation, liberation, freedom. Except, it didn't. Instead, the Post writes, the archivists at Truman Presidential Library say that what Truman was doing in the photo was receiving a turkey. The Poultry Board gave Truman turkeys every year, and we think they probably ended up on the dinner table. President Eisenhower likewise, the Post argues, ate his turkeys. The Post explains that John F. Kennedy casually spared a turkey on November 19, 1963, just days before his assassination. When given a bird wearing a sign reading, "Good eatin', Mr. President," Kennedy said, "Let's just keep him." But it wasn't an official pardon, says Kennedy archivist Steve Plotkin. It was probably offhand and purely spontaneous. Thereafter, the national turkeys were commonly sent to petting zoos rather than to the dinner table, but in possibly another example of the Mandela effect, there were no official presidential pardons until WhiteHouseHistory.org explains the formalities of pardoning a turkey gelled by 1989, when President George H.W. Bush, with animal rights activists picketing nearby, quipped, "But let me assure you, in this fine Tom turkey, that he will not end up on anyone's dinner table. Not this guy. He's granted a presidential pardon as of right now." The tradition has been carried on since then. This year, President Biden pardoned turkeys named Liberty and Belle. Sadly, however, turkeys are not bred for long lives. The National Turkey Federation estimates that a pardoned bird will be lucky to live 2 years after it's saved by the president. Oddly, for their popularity, the word turkey has a negative connotation, especially when applied to an unsuccessful play or film. Harold Meyerson, editor-at-large of the news organization The American Prospect, explained in 2019 that this was derived from the early 20th century, when tourists would crowd New York during the holiday season. Accordingly, a very large number of shows opened every year in November, and even if they only stuck around until shortly after New Year, they were usually able to turn a profit, provided that the house had been reasonably full. What that meant was that an awful lot of awful shows opened up every year around Thanksgiving, and the critics at Variety, who were obligated to attend and review every one of them, took to calling those shows turkeys, and the term stuck. And Broadway shows aren't the only places where turkeys struggle. Columnist Michael Morgan noted in a 2020 edition of the Salisbury, Delaware Daily Times that during World Wars I and II, holiday turkey shortages occurred due to shortages of feed and demands of the military. In some areas, he writes, the shortage was particularly acute. On the East Coast, less than half the turkeys needed for the traditional Thanksgiving feast were available. There was a similar, if not as acute, problem in 2022, when the supply was heavily impacted by an avian flu outbreak. Perhaps the greatest challenges, however, have come to the original, wild version of the turkey. A bulletin of the National Wild Turkey Federation notes that as the settlers tamed the wilderness, cleared the woodlands, and pushed westward, fewer wild turkeys were left behind. Connecticut had lost its wild turkeys by 1813. Vermont held out until 1842, and other states followed. By 1920, the wild turkey was lost from 18 of the original 39 states and Ontario, Canada, in its supposed ancestral range. The 5 subspecies of wild turkeys in the United States probably declined to their lowest numbers in the late 1930s. According to data collected by Henry S. Mosby, in 1937, the wild turkey was in trouble, although conservation efforts after the Second World War have returned huntable populations in most states. And while some 46 million turkeys will grace our holiday tables this Thanksgiving, the National Turkey Federation notes that turkey is no longer seen as just a holiday market, but as a low-fat staple for health-conscious consumers. And because of that, turkey consumption per capita in the United States has nearly doubled since 1970 to 15.3 pounds per person per year. But oddly, for a food that seems so quintessentially American, the United States is only third internationally in per capita turkey consumption, behind Israel and Hungary. Pretty much since the invention of cooking food, the process for getting that food to your mouth has been, well, a thing. Your hands are often perfectly fine utensils for eating food, but humans have developed a number of specialized tools that are specifically designed to get food from the table to the mouth. And the utensils that we use today seem such common sense. They're just so natural that you can hardly imagine life before them. But one of the most common tools that you probably use every day has a surprisingly recent history. The forgotten history of the fork deserves to be remembered. We know that sharp utensils for hunting or cutting have been around for millions of years, with tool-making workshops discovered at least from the lower Paleolithic era. Early members of the Homo genus created sharp tools by hitting 2 rocks, a hammerstone used against some sort of core rock, together, creating a fracture with a sharp edge. This allowed them to hunt with projectiles or scrape skins for clothing, so the basic version of the knife has been around for as long as mankind. The exact origin of the spoon is unknown, but while not as prehistoric as the knife, spoons have been around at least thousands of years. In fact, the etymology of spoon in Anglo-Saxon languages means wood chip, whereas the Greek and Latin forms come from cucchiella, meaning a spiral shell, both being the materials that would have formed the first spoons for the corresponding regions. The spoon shape makes sense, being like a cupped hand and able to hold liquids or shovel any variety of foodstuffs into a hungry mouth. Archaeological examples of spoons date back to ancient Egypt, about 1000 BC, although those were ornate and likely used for ritualistic purposes. But you might be surprised to find out that the modern fork wasn't common in most of Europe until at least the 16th century, and not in the United States until around the 18th century. And it has something of a sordid history, considered to be at best superfluous and maybe even vulgar. In fact, the Latin forca means pitchfork, a fact that clergy use to point out its connotations to the devil, or insist that one not toss food into the mouth like hay into a barn. Some scholars believe that the popularity of the modern personal eating fork was originally brought to Venice from the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, where they were common by the 4th century, and the Middle East, where they were common by the 9th century. But the spread throughout Europe is suggested to be directly influenced by the spread of pasta. From Venice, it crept through Italy, Spain, then France. The first written mention of a prong to lift pasta for eating comes from a recipe for lasagna in a cookbook presented to King Robert of Anjou earlier in the 14th century. But far from the 14th century, the earliest known forks made of bone were found in Chinese archaeological sites dating back to the Bronze Age. They were only 1 or 2 pronged, most likely cooking or serving utensils, not eating utensils, as forks originally were used over the fire or for holding food while carving portions. Instead of forks for eating, people just used their hands, with food being served on trenchers. These were slabs of stale or hard bread that could hold cooked meat or vegetables and could be used to convey your meal directly to your mouth. These trenchers likely evolved into the first pizzas or pita bread. But eating with the hands wasn't slovenly or without rules. Hand washing was included in the event of a meal, and recipes exist for water used for hand washing at least from the 14th century. Water was boiled with rosemary or sage or chamomile with lemons or oranges. The boiled water would be sanitary, and the additions of herbs or citrus made it have antibacterial properties. Not to mention it would have smelled good and been pleasing with the meal. It seems that humans were given hands for the purpose of eating, or at least according to 11th century European church authorities. One of the most oft-quoted texts regarding early fork use in Europe is by St. Peter Damian in his De Institutione Monalis, written about 1059. In his work, he criticizes the use of a fork by a Byzantine princess who married a Venetian doge. Most likely, the princess who scandalized European clergy with her decadent use of a fork was Maria Argira, or Maria Argyropolina, daughter of Byzantine Emperor Romanos II, who married Giovanni Orsello, the son of the Doge of Venice, Pietro II Orsello. Anecdotally, at their wedding feast in 1003, she used her golden eating utensils and scandalized the region with her sinful and indecent 2-pronged fork. Feelings regarding the use of forks were perhaps best summed up with the thought that God in his wisdom has provided man with natural forks, his fingers. Therefore it is an insult to him to substitute artificial metallic forks for them when eating. When the dogaressa died in a plague, Damien suggested that the cause was her excessive delicacy. By the 1300s, merchants who were traveling west to east and back would carry utensils, often including forks, with them in a box, but the rest of Europe was mostly still just carrying a knife, which could be used for all sorts of utility purposes, and using that as their sole utensil. But in 1533, Catherine de' Medici, the Italian noblewoman who married Henry, the second son of King Francis I and Queen Claude of France, famously brought her fork to France, and from there it spread throughout Europe. According to one biographer, Catherine was the most powerful woman in 16th century Europe, and her dowry included dozens of forks created by the Renaissance goldsmith and artist Benvenuto Cellini. Forks were known to be widespread in Italy by the end of the 16th century, and in France, Spain, and other parts of Europe by the 17th century. Although more common, they were still largely used by the wealthy and might have been adopted slowly. Early table forks were described as either so robust as to hold meat for cutting, so more like a carving fork, or so dainty that they would only be used for eating sweets at the end of a meal. The first known mention of a fork in English was in a will in 1463, when the bequeathing of a silver fork suggested that they were an expensive luxury item. And forks did not come into common use in England until the 18th century. Forks were considered unmanly and not commonly used by sailors in the Royal Navy well into the 19th century. The current 4-tine fork used today was designed by Gennaro Spadaccini in the court of the Burgundian King Ferdinand IV at the end of the 18th century. Ferdinand specifically requested a fork be made for pasta with sauce, which was difficult to eat with a long-handled 3-tined fork. The 4-tined fork was shorter, made the task simple with the twirl method. And when it comes to forks, we have to deal with an uncomfortable reality. Americans use forks differently than, well, pretty much anybody else. So much so that Geir Gartner, who was a German escaped POW who managed to live on the lam in the United States for nearly 40 years, said that he had to relearn how to use a fork because he was afraid that that would reveal that he was German. So much so that there are stories that U.S. spies in the Second World War were captured by the Germans because the Germans noticed their American use of a fork, although that story might have been derived from a movie rather than a real event. An April 2006 article in the Chicago Tribune describes the difference. A right-handed person eating in the European manner holds the knife in her right hand, the fork in her left. With the tines of the fork facing down, she pins the food to her plate and uses her knife to cut. Then, still using the fork in her left hand, she conveys the food to her mouth, the tines still facing downward. A right-handed person eating in the American manner cuts the food in the same way, but after cutting, she puts the knife down, switches the fork to her right hand, and with the tines facing up, brings the food to her mouth. To prepare for the next bite, she must switch the fork back to her left hand, pick up the knife with her right hand, and start all over again. The reason might be that the U.S. was particularly slow to adopt the fork. Author James Dietz notes in his book Small Things Forgotten, an archaeology of early American life, archaeological evidence doesn't show forks becoming common in the United States until the late 18th century. This created a problem starting in the late 17th century, when knives began to change. Anecdotally, this may have come from the house of the Duc de Richelieu, better known as Cardinal Richelieu. His rise to power, both in the church and politics, in the early 17th century meant that he hosted many gatherings, at which heated discussions regarding politics and religion may have led to many altercations involving the sharp eating utensil. He was known for being particularly annoyed by his guests using their pointed knives to pick their teeth after meals. Because of this, he gathered up all the knives in his possession and had the points ground off into the rounded shape that is today better known as a butter knife. In 1669, French King Louis XIV ruled that knives both on the street and the dinner table must be blunt. Henceforth, steak knives to cut meat were given only when needed, or servants would cut food into bite-sized pieces. In any case, as forks became more prevalent, table knives no longer needed points that were used to stab or pick up food, and new table manners resulted in tamer knives. Americans, importing their utensils from England, started to have rounded knives, but did not yet regularly use forks. Thus, a spoon was used to hold the meat, while the knife cut, and the food was conveyed with the fingers or the spoon. Once forks became more common, they were naturally used with the tines up, mimicking the spoon. Now, American visitors to Europe tend to complain that Europeans use their forks upside down. The method of holding the fork in the left hand and the knife in the right, and then cutting, and then switching the fork to the right hand in order to convey the food to the mouth, which is called the cut and switch, or by etiquette guru Emily Post, the zigzag style of eating, is almost unique to America, so much so that it is today referred to as American style, as opposed to continental or European style. This might again have to do with the late U.S. adoption of the fork. While Europeans were using forks, Americans were still largely using spoons. Spoons are almost always used in the dominant hand, as the weaker hand usually lacks the dexterity to bring liquid in a spoon safely to the mouth without spilling. As Americans adopted forks, they simply retained the style. It's also possible that Americans derived the cut and switch from French etiquette. In the early 18th century, it became the fashion in France to lower the knife, possibly as a symbol of trust at a time when stabbings could happen over disagreements at meals. The practice also simply might have seemed more delicate, and using the dominant hand to convey food was more effective and elegant, dropping less food. But the fashion changed, and by 1853, a French etiquette book deemed the switching method to be no longer fashionable. Now the knife would be held in the right, usually dominant hand, and the fork retained in the left hand. Either we didn't get the message that the fashion had changed, or maybe because Americans were still largely using spoons as opposed to forks, but America never seemed to make that switch. There are 7 parts of a fork which are variable: the points or tips of each of the tines, the slots or spaces between the tines themselves, which connect to the root, which connects to the back, which connects to the neck, which connects to the handle that you hold. These various parts change slightly depending on the use of the fork. In terms of tableware design, there's somewhere in the realm of 30+ different types of forks, depending on the use or course or the specific food being served, although etiquette experts list 7 types as most common: the table fork, deli fork, fish fork, fruit fork, salad fork, ice cream fork, dessert fork, and oyster fork. Knowing what the fork to use in a large table setting can be daunting. Just remember, start at the outside and work your way in, saving that enticing smaller dessert fork above your plate for last. Like many tools, industrialization made it much cheaper to produce forks, and they could be kept clean more easily. The development of stainless steel was particularly important in the history of table utensils. And then came plastic and molding processes, and that brought disposable utensils to the scene. So that today, trying to eat chicken and potatoes at a medieval times theme restaurant without utensils is kind of considered barbaric kitsch. It's interesting that something that we thought of as completely unnecessary just a couple hundred years ago has become such an integral part of our lives that today it's the thought of, say, eating pasta with your fingers that we think of as vulgar. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.